She was chained in a cellar for 8 weeks until a stranger heard her crying in the dark. The first scream came at midnight. It moved through the frozen Colorado darkness like something alive muffled, desperate, clawing through the walls of the October night before it reached him. Caleb Hart had been in Cedar Ridge exactly 8 hours when he heard it. 8 hours since stepping off the rust-stained train from Denver, with nothing but a land deed he had never seen a trunk that held the sum of his 24 years, and the bone-deep certainty that his old life was finally mercifully dead. He had come to this brutal corner of the Colorado Territory to disappear, to start clean. But some sounds don't allow you to stay still. He was already on his feet before the thought fully formed, his hand reaching for the rifle propped against the wall, his boots finding the floor with the automatic precision of a man who had spent years sleeping light. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was cold, the windows thick with frost that had crept across the glass while he slept. He stood in the center of the small ranch house, 3 rooms, a stone fireplace, walls that needed patching, and listened. Silence. Then it came again. Not a scream this time. Something worse. A muffled cry, rhythmic and desperate, the sound of a human being fighting against something she could not overcome. The sound of effort that had long since passed, hope, and continued on sheer animal refusal to stop. It was coming from the property next door. Caleb had noticed the house when he arrived that afternoon, exhausted and dust-covered from the 2-day journey from Denver. Hard not to notice it. While his own modest ranch leaned gently westward and smelled of abandonment, the neighboring estate sprawled with the confidence of money, a 2-story, Victorian-painted dark green, wrap-around porches trimmed with gingerbread woodwork that seemed almost absurd against the raw Colorado landscape. Behind it stood a proper barn, a carriage house, what looked like workers' quarters. The grounds were immaculate, the fences perfectly maintained, the firewood stacked in precise geometric rows beneath blue canvas tarps. Not a soul in sight, not a curl of smoke from any chimney, not a lamp lit in any window as the sun went down. The silence of that grand house had felt wrong. Not peaceful wrong, but held breath wrong, like the moment before something breaks. Now crossing the frost-stiffened field between the properties with the lantern swinging, and the rifle cold in his hands, Caleb understood what that wrongness had been. He circled the main structure. Nothing. The back of the property opened onto a sloping yard that led toward a creek he could hear but not see. Outbuildings formed dark shapes against the stars. The crying had stopped, replaced by something deliberate, a rhythmic banging, measured and insistent, the sound of someone who had been at it long enough that desperation had hardened into pure determination. He followed the sound to a structure he might have mistaken for a root cellar. A wooden door set at an angle into the earth near the back corner of the property, half concealed by bushes that hadn't been trimmed with the obsessive care applied to the rest of the grounds. The lantern caught the gleam of metal, a chain heavy gauge wrapped multiple times around the door handles and secured with a padlock so new it still shone. This was no wine storage. "Hello," Caleb called. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Is someone down there?" The banging stopped, a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. "Then please." A voice barely there, coarse and thin, broken by weeks of disuse and screaming, and the particular exhaustion that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. "Please, whoever you are, please help me." A girl's voice, young. Caleb set down the lantern and examined the lock. Good quality. Expensive. The chain wrapped 4 times around the handles. Whoever had done this had wanted to make absolutely certain their prisoner couldn't claw her way out. He didn't have tools to cut it. What he had was a rifle and a rage building in his chest that surprised him with its force. "Step back from the door," he called. "Get as far from it as you can." He raised the rifle and aimed at the lock's shank. "Cover your ears." The shot cracked through the night like a thunderclap. The lock shattered. The chain went slack. Somewhere in the main house, a dog erupted in frantic barking, then fell silent, as though even the animal understood not to draw attention. No lights appeared. No one came running. Caleb unwrapped the chain with hands that were not quite steady and pulled the doors open. The smell hit him first, the particular misery of a confined space, unwashed, damp, dark, and underneath it all, the faint, sick sweetness of illness. He held the lantern out and let the light spill down the wooden steps. She was in the far corner, one arm raised against the sudden brightness, the other hugged tight across her chest. What had once been a dress hung around her in filthy tatters. Her hair was matted, her face so thin that the bones of her skull pressed visibly against skin, that had taken on the gray papery quality of someone losing the fight against starvation. She had been pretty once he could see the ghost of it, but beauty had been stripped away, along with everything else, leaving something more essential, the fierce, exhausted determination in eyes that had not yet gone dull. She was not yet finished. On the stone wall beside her, nearly invisible in the shadows, Caleb saw the marks, thin parallel scratches made by a human fingernail row after patient row. She had kept count. She had tracked every single day. 8 weeks, he counted before he could stop himself. 8 weeks of marks. "It's all right," he said, and hated how inadequate the words were. "I'm going to help you. Can you walk?" She lowered her arms, slowly studying him. The study was careful, intelligent measuring, not the blind gratitude he might have expected. She was watching for something, Lie's cruelty, the particular violence that had put her here. He understood without being told that she had learned not to trust easily. Whatever she saw in his face must have been acceptable. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately. Caleb descended the stairs, quickly reaching for her. She flinched, a full-body recoil, pressing herself back against the stone, and he stopped, hands open and visible. "I won't hurt you," he said, "but you need help. Let me carry you out of here." "You're not him," she whispered. It was not quite a question. "No, I'm your neighbor. I moved in today. My name is Caleb Hart." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she gave a small nod that cost her something. "Elena," she said, "Elena Mercer." He moved slowly, telegraphing each motion, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, much in terror wrapped in rags. He could feel her shaking as he carried her up the stairs, felt the rapid, shallow flutter of her breathing against his chest. When they came out into the open air, she turned her face toward the sky without thinking, and the tears came, silent, tracking through the grime on her cheeks. Not sadness, not relief, something more complicated than either. "How long?" Caleb asked quietly, already dreading the answer. "I lost count." Her voice was barely there. "Weeks, maybe 8 weeks." She swallowed with difficulty. "He stopped coming, stopped bringing food. I thought—" She paused. "I thought he'd decided it was easier to let me die." "Who did this to you?" "My stepfather." A long pause, then 2 words spoken with a hatred so controlled it was almost worse than fury. "Vernon Hale." "What?" Inside his own small ranch, Caleb laid her by the fire and built the flames high. She curled into herself immediately, knees to chest, eyes tracking the unfamiliar room, with the wariness of a creature that has learned that every enclosure is a potential trap. He brought water. She drank too fast and choked, and he made her slow down. Small sips, watching the color change in her face as her body remembered what hydration felt like. He warmed beans, found bread that was only slightly stale, watched her eat with a concentrated desperation that made something ache behind his sternum. When she had eaten enough to think clearly, she spoke. "My mother married Vernon when I was 14. Her voice had steadied, not calm but deliberate, the voice of someone reciting facts they have rehearsed so many times they no longer feel them. She died 6 months later. Fever, everyone said. Afterward, it was just the 2 of us in that big house. In Cedar Ridge thinks he's generous. The in Cedar Ridge thinks he's generous." The word came out like something she was spitting from her teeth. "He's not. He's cruel and controlling. He liked that my mother was beautiful and refined. Once she was gone, he saw me as his property, an asset to be managed and eventually sold. And you refused. 3 months ago, one of his business associates came to visit. Edgar Thorne, 50 years old, widowed, looking for a young wife. Vernon offered me like merchandise. Said I'd marry Edgar within the month." She looked at Caleb directly for the first time, and what he saw in her eyes was not broken. "I told him I'd rather die. So he decided to help you find your way there. He dragged me to the cellar himself, locked the door, told me I'd stay until I came to my senses. That a few days without food and light would make me more reasonable. A sound that might have been a laugh in another lifetime. A few days became weeks. He came less and less often. The last time I saw him was, I don't know, a week ago. He said he was going to Denver and would decide what to do with me when he returned." Caleb looked at this young woman, barely 17, all iron and survival, and felt something cold and purposeful settle into his chest. Not anger exactly, something cleaner than anger. Clarity. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go to the sheriff, tell him everything." Elena looked at him with eyes that held no hope at all. "You don't understand what Vernon is," she said. "He's one of the most powerful men in this county. He has connections to the territorial governor. The sheriff works for him in everything but name. They'll say I'm a hysterical girl and inventing stories to justify disobedience. She said the next word with savage precision. Vernon has already been laying groundwork, telling people I've been acting strangely since my mother died, that he's worried about my mental state. Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking through the shape of it. He had seen this kind before, not in Colorado, but in other towns, other territories. Men who understood that the most effective prison had no visible walls. Men who used law and society and the simple mathematics of credibility to ensure that anyone they harmed would never be believed. Vernon Hale hadn't just locked Elena in a cellar. He had been building the legal cage for months before he ever put her in the physical one. "How long until you turn 18, he asked. 8 months. 8 months. An eternity. Far too long to expect Vernon to simply accept that his property had escaped. Caleb looked at her. She looked back. "Then you stay here," he said, "with me. I'll protect you until you're of age." "You can't. You don't know what You can't. You don't know what he's capable of. He'll use the law, his money, his influence. He'll bury you so deep you'll never see daylight again." A beat. "You just got here. You have your own life to build. This isn't your fight." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Thomas. He thought about the particular weight of a choice not made, a moment past, a chance to act, that becomes in the span of a heartbeat something you will carry the rest of your life. "Maybe it is now," he said simply. "Maybe that's what being neighbors means." Elena's face crumpled. She pressed her hands over her mouth to hold back what was trying to come through, and Caleb looked away, giving her the only privacy the small room allowed. He had just gotten himself into something. He knew it as clearly as he had ever known anything. But looking at those marks on the cellar wall, all those patient, uncountable scratches, he knew equally clearly that walking away would have cost him something he could never get back. "I did." They talked through the night. Elena was sharper than the darkness had any right to leave her. Once the first shock of warmth and food had worked through her system, she began to think practically precisely without sentimentality about the shape of what they were facing. She knew Vernon's habits, his schedule, his social obligations. She knew he had planned to return from Denver today or tomorrow, which meant they had hours, possibly fewer. "He'll come here first," she said. "When he finds the cellar broken open, this is the closest property. He'll assume you're involved." "Good," Caleb said. "Let him. He'll claim you kidnapped me, that you're holding me against my will. The sheriff will believe him because Vernon pays his salary. You'll be arrested, and I'll be right back in that cellar." She paused. "Or somewhere worse." Caleb was quiet for a moment, turning over their options, the way you turn over a worn map, looking for a route that isn't there. Then the answer came to him, not subtle, not elegant, but legally sound and completely impossible to argue around. "Not if we get married," he said. The words hung in the air between them like something physical. Elena stared at him. "You said it yourself," Caleb continued, keeping his voice even and practical. "The only way you're free of his guardianship is if you marry. So we get married today if possible. Then Vernon has no legal claim over you at all." I know how it sounds. It's insane. Maybe. But it works." He leaned forward slightly. "I know it's not how either of us imagined this going, but it's a solution, a legal one that Vernon can't touch. And then when you turn 18, if you want an annulment, we get one. Or we stay married in name only. I'll sign papers giving you complete freedom to live your own life. This isn't about controlling you, Elena. It's about making sure no one else can." She was quiet for a long time. He could see her working through it, examining the idea from every angle, testing for the trap beneath it, the way someone who has been locked in a cellar learns to test every door. "And then what?" she said finally. "We're just stuck married to each other for the rest of our lives." "Not if you don't want to be." He said it plainly without hurt. "We get an annulment the day you turn 18 if that's what you choose. Or we stay married in name only. I'll sign whatever papers you need. This is a partnership, not a purchase." More silence. "And why would you do this?" she asked. The question was genuine, not suspicious exactly, but cautious. "Risk everything. Tie yourself to a stranger. Make yourself a target for a powerful man's revenge." "Why?" Caleb thought about how to answer that. Not about Thomas, not yet. That was for a different night, a different kind of darkness between them. "Because I heard you crying in the dark," he said, "and I couldn't walk away." Elena looked at him for a very long time. "If we do this," she said slowly, "it's a partnership, not you saving me. I pull my weight. I help with the ranch with whatever needs doing. I am not going to be something helpless that you have to carry. I wouldn't want you to be. And when I turn 18, we reassess, figure out what makes sense for both of us. Agreed. She took a long breath, steadied herself. He could see her gathering courage the way a soldier gathers weapons. All right, she said. Before I come to my senses, let's go get married. Mom! The town of Cedar Ridge was small, even by frontier standards. One main street, false-fronted buildings, a church, a general store, a saloon, and the combination courthouse and sheriff's office that served as the seat of county government. A population of perhaps 300 souls scattered across surrounding ranches and mining claims. They rode in together on Caleb's horse Elena behind him, with his spare coat pulled up to hide her face. The county clerk was a thin man with spectacles and the manner of someone who took great pride in paperwork. He looked up when they entered, his expression shifting from boredom to curiosity as he took in Elena's youth and Caleb's rough frontier appearance. "We need a marriage license," Caleb said. The clerk's eyebrows climbed, but he pulled out his forms. The information was provided. The clerk frowned slightly at Elena's age 17 and asked about parental consent. Caleb answered smoothly. Her parents were dead. She had been living with a stepfather, but since they were marrying, consent was no longer legally required. True if misleadingly presented. When the clerk hesitated, Caleb placed bills on the counter. Family emergency. The waiting period needed to be waived. Money spoke in ways that arguments couldn't. They left the clerk's office with a license in Caleb's pocket. Reverend Matthews was the surprise. A black man in his 50s with silver threading through his close-cropped hair. He studied them both with a combination of wisdom and measured kindness that made Elena for the first time relax slightly. He led them into his small office and asked his careful questions. He was looking for coercion, fear, legal problems. He was thorough and unhurried. Elena didn't lie to him. She didn't tell him about the cellar. Not all of it, but she told him about Vernon's cruelty, about the forced engagement, about her need to escape a situation that had become genuinely dangerous. She told it plainly without drama. When she finished, Matthews looked at Caleb. "You're willing to take on this responsibility," he said, "to bind yourself to this young woman and all the consequences that will follow." "I am. You understand that marriage is a sacred covenant, not a legal trick. I understand that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing are the same. This is one of those times." Matthews was quiet for a moment, studying them both. Then he nodded with the gravity of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and had made his peace with it. "I'll marry you," he said, "but I want your word that you'll treat this marriage with the respect it deserves. Even if it began from necessity, the vows you speak today will matter." "You have my word," Caleb said. "And mine," Elena added. The witnesses were the Reverend's wife, a kind-faced woman who immediately took Elena's arm with gentle practicality, and the church caretaker, an elderly man who seemed genuinely delighted. They stood in the small sanctuary, autumn light slanting through plain glass windows, and spoke words that had been spoken by countless couples in countless circumstances across human history. Caleb meant every one of them, not because he was in love, he had known this woman for less than a day, but because love wasn't only one thing, and what he felt in that moment was the genuine intention to protect, to stand beside, to honor a person's right to be free. That was a kind of vow worth keeping. Elena's voice trembled when she repeated the words, but she didn't falter. And when the Reverend pronounced them married, she didn't pull away when Caleb gently took her hand. Elena Hart stepped into the autumn sunlight, no longer a ward, no longer property, no longer something to be managed and sold. They were halfway back to the ranch when the black, lacquered carriage appeared on the road ahead, drawn by matched horses driven by a man whose face was already a thundercloud. Elena's hands tightened on Caleb's waist until her knuckles ached. "That's him," she whispered. "God, that's him." Vernon Hale pulled the carriage to a stop in the center of the road, blocking their path. He was a man in his 50s, well-dressed in city clothes, silver-haired with features that might have been handsome if they hadn't been distorted by a lifetime of contempt for anyone he considered beneath him. He looked at Elena the way a man looks at a possession that has developed the inconvenient habit of moving on its own. "Elena," his voice carried across the distance with practiced ease, the voice of a man who was accustomed to being heard. "Get away from that man and come here immediately." No, her voice was small, but it was steady. Vernon's eyes moved to Caleb, slow, measuring. "You." Not a greeting, a notation. "I don't know who you think you are or what you think you're doing, but you've made a serious mistake. That girl is my legal ward. By taking her, you've committed kidnapping. I can have you arrested within the hour." Elena isn't your ward anymore, Caleb said, keeping his voice level. She's my wife. As of 2 hours ago, legally married in the church in town. You have no claim over her. The words hit Vernon Hale like a physical blow. His face went red, then white, then settled into something worse than either the cold, particular fury of a powerful man who has just been outmaneuvered by someone he considers his inferior. That's impossible. She's 17. She needs my consent. She's 17 and married. The law doesn't require your consent when she's spoken her vows. Check with the county clerk if you don't believe me. The silence stretched. Vernon's eyes moved between them, calculating, not defeated. Caleb could see it happening. The man wasn't surrendering. He was regrouping, reassessing, finding the next angle. This isn't over, Vernon said softly. Not even close. He looked at Caleb with the expression of a man making a note in a permanent ledger. You've made an enemy today, Mr. Hart, and you would have no idea what that means. He turned the carriage around in a deliberate, unhurried arc and drove away. The dust settled slowly around them. Elena was shaking so hard Caleb could feel it through his back. He reached back and steadied her. He's not done, she whispered. You don't understand. The cellar was just the beginning. Caleb thought about the small ranch waiting for them, the broken fences, the sagging barn, the endless work ahead. He thought about Thomas. He thought about what it cost a man to stand still when he should have acted and what it might cost him to act when most would stand still. Then he's going to learn something about frontier justice, he said. Out here, money and influence only go so far. What matters is whether you can hold your ground when someone tries to take what's yours. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm not yours. I know, Caleb said. That's exactly the point. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, the mountains drawing long evening shadows across the valley. When they reached the ranch and Elena slid down from the horse, she stood for a moment looking at the weathered house, Mullen imperfect and real, with an expression Caleb didn't yet have words for. He would learn the word for it later. He would understand it in stages the way you understand most things that matter. The word was home. The first 3 days of their marriage passed in a rhythm that felt both temporary and permanent. Caleb worked the land from first light until his hands were cracked and bleeding, mending fences, patching the barn roof, splitting wood for the winter that the sky was already promising. Elena worked beside him. She moved slowly, her body still rebuilding from what the cellar had taken, but she was insistent about it, not asking permission, simply appearing each morning ready to work. They didn't talk much during those early days. Words felt complicated, weighted with the strangeness of what they were to each other. Instead, they communicated in the simpler language of shared labor. Caleb steadying the ladder while Elena cleaned the stovepipe, Elena handing him nails while he repaired the broken bed frame. At night, she slept in the bedroom. He took the bedroll by the fire. The arrangement was never discussed. It simply was. On the fourth day, Vernon Hale made his first move. It started with the store owner, a pleasant woman named Mrs. Patterson, who smiled carefully when Caleb came in for supplies and then explained with evident discomfort that she wouldn't be extending credit. Mr. Hale was an important customer. She couldn't afford to offend him. The banker followed the same script delivered with the same carefully averted eyes. The sheriff's visit came on the fifth day. Sheriff Coleman, a thick-bodied man in his 40s who arrived with 2 deputies and a folded document in a manner that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. I have here a complaint filed by Mr. Vernon Hale, Coleman said, reading from the paper with excessive care, alleging that you coerced his ward into an unlawful marriage through threats and intimidation. He's requesting the marriage be annulled and Miss Mercer returned to his custody pending investigation. That's a lie, Elena said, stepping forward past Caleb's attempt to shield her. Every word of it. I married Caleb of my own free will. Vernon is the one who should be investigated. Go look at the cellar on his property. You'll find evidence. Mr. Hale has addressed that. Says the cellar contains his wine collection secured against theft. He claims you were never imprisoned there. He also has a letter, Coleman continued with the manner of a man delivering a verdict he is not proud of from a Dr. Harrison in Denver, expressing concern about your mental state following your mother's death. Elena went still. I've never met Dr. Harrison. Be that as it may, he paid him to write that. Her voice was flat, certain. He's been building that story for months. It's what he does. He builds the cage before he puts you in it. Coleman looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression, not belief exactly, but a crack in the skepticism. Something that had hurt her and registered it even if he couldn't act on it yet. I recommend you both come to town tomorrow, he said finally. Give statements. Let this go through proper channels. It was a trap. They all knew it. Vernon's territory, Vernon's witnesses, Vernon's version of truth told to a system that had already been paid to believe it. But they had no real choice. We'll be there, Caleb said. That night, after Coleman and his deputies had ridden away, Caleb and Elena sat by the fire and made plans. They talked through witnesses Reverend Matthews, who had spoken with Elena before the ceremony and could confirm she wasn't coerced. The county clerk, who had the paperwork. They talked about Vernon's patterns, his weaknesses, the places where his armor of respectability had seams. He's going to try to prove I'm unfit, Elena said. Bring that fake doctor's letter, find witnesses who'll say I was unstable. Paint you as a fortune hunter who took advantage of a mentally incompetent girl. Then we need our own witnesses, people who saw you who can say you're in your right mind. Elena was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. It might not be enough, she said. Vernon is very good at this. He's had years of practice using the system to get what he wants. Then we tell your story, Caleb said. All of it. Everything he did to you. We make it so damning that he can't spin his way out. That's risky. If we accuse him publicly and can't prove it, he could sue us for slander. Take everything. Caleb was quiet. How much did you inherit from your mother? He asked. When she died. Something crossed Elena's face, something he couldn't read yet. Something shadowed and complicated. She was quiet for long enough that he noticed. Nothing, she said finally. My mother had nothing of her own. Vernon made sure of that. Another pause shorter. She tried to leave him once, about 3 months before she died. What stopped her? Elena looked at the fire. The light moved across her face. He did, she said. And then she was quiet, and something in the quality of that silence told Caleb not to push further. Not tonight. He didn't know yet what lived in that silence. He would learn soon enough. What he did know, staring at the fire while Elena curled into herself, was something that went deeper than weariness, was that Vernon Hale was more monstrous than he had understood. The hearing was tomorrow. They would need more than the truth. The truth in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, in the year of our Lord, 1882, was only as strong as the man willing to speak it and how much money that man had in the bank. What they needed was a witness. The night before the hearing, Vernon Hale came to their door. He didn't knock. He simply stood outside in the dark, visible through the frost-edged glass, a shape against the deeper darkness, perfectly still in the October wind, for long enough that it stopped feeling accidental. Caleb had his hand on the rifle before he registered the decision. Elena at the stove went so quiet that the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Vernon turned and walked away. Unhurried, deliberate, a man making a statement with the architecture of silence. He's reminding us he knows where we live, Elena said when the sound of footsteps had fully faded. Her voice was measured, not afraid, or rather, she had learned to think through fear the way a body learns to breathe through smoke. He can know where we live, Caleb said. It's a public fact. That's not the point. The point is that he came in the dark and he stood outside without making a sound because that's what he does. She set down the pot she'd been holding. He doesn't need to threaten out loud. He just needs you to know he's thinking about you. Caleb thought about that as he watched the darkness outside for another long minute. Then he sat down and they went back to planning, because there was nothing else to do, and surrender was not a language either of them spoke. They had very little to bring into that courtroom tomorrow. The Reverend and his wife could testify that Elena had seemed rational and willing during the marriage ceremony. The county clerk had records showing everything was properly documented. Beyond that, they had Elena's word against Vernon's reputation and $1,000 of credibility bought with social standing and church donations. What they needed was a crack in the armor. Your mother, Caleb said later in the evening when the fire had burned lower and the hour had grown honest. You said she tried to leave him. What stopped her? Elena was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she might not answer. He made her understand, she said finally, that she had nowhere to go. That everything, her reputation, her finances, her relationship with the people of this town, everything existed because of him and could be taken back by him. A pause, so she was educated and capable, and she had nothing of her own. He made sure of that. He was very systematic about it. Caleb thought about the particular elegance of that kind of cruelty, not the dramatic violence of a man who hits, but the slow, patient dismantling of everything that might allow escape. Building the prison before you ever lock the door. And then she died, he said. Yes, Elena looked at her hands. She died. Something in her voice, a flatness, a careful avoidance of inflection, made him look at her more carefully. Elena, she met his eyes. And in that moment in the dying firelight, he saw something he hadn't seen there before. Not fear, not grief, something colder and more specific. There was a woman, Elena said, a housekeeper. She worked for Vernon for 2 years. She quit a few weeks after I disappeared. She said the next sentence with the deliberate calm of someone who has turned a thought over so many times that the sharp edges have worn smooth. She knew things about my mother, about what happened toward the end. Do you know where she is? She mentioned she was staying at Mrs. Chen's boarding house before going back to her sister's ranch. A pause. I don't know if she'll talk. I don't know if she'll talk to us. Vernon has ways of making people understand the cost of honesty. Her name? Margaret Winters. Amen. The preliminary hearing was exactly what Elena had predicted. Judge Thornton presided from the bench with the weary skepticism of a man who had seen too many versions of this money arrayed against truth power, arranged against vulnerability, a system that called itself justice, while it processed the wishes of those who could afford to purchase it. Vernon's lead lawyer, a man named Garrison, who had clearly done this 100 times before, built the case with practiced efficiency. Dr. Harrison's letter, a document from a physician Elena had never met, diagnosing her with hysteria and nervous collapse following her mother's death. Character witnesses, merchants, and churchgoers who testified that Elena had seemed withdrawn and strange in the weeks before she disappeared. A portrait of a grieving, unstable girl who had been taken advantage of by a calculating stranger. Vernon himself took the stand with the demeanor of a man bearing a burden he had chosen not to complain about. He spoke of his concern for Elena's mental health, his attempts to provide structure and supervision, his heartbreak when she disappeared. He spoke of the cellar with blameless reasonableness, his wine collection, his valuable goods, the security measures any responsible man would take. If Elena had wandered into a locked space against his explicit warnings, which he doubted, she had only her own defiance to blame. It was masterful. It was the performance of a man who had rehearsed this exact story for months. When Garrison finished, Judge Thornton looked at Caleb with the expression of a man giving someone a rope and waiting to see what they did with it. Mr. Hart, he said, you're representing yourself. You may cross-examine the witness. Caleb stood aware of every eye in the crowded gallery. He had no legal training, no courtroom experience, no rhetorical strategy. What he had was a set of questions and the patience to ask them slowly. Mr. Hale, he said, when did you last see Elena before I found her? A slight pause. I was in Denver on business, several weeks. And during that time you left an allegedly mentally fragile 17-year-old girl alone in a large house with no supervision. My staff were given time off while I traveled. Elena had adequate provisions. Adequate provisions. Caleb let the words sit for a moment. And the staff, those workers you mentioned, could they testify to leaving Elena well provisioned before their time off? Could they describe her mental state? Could they tell us what she ate, what she did, who she spoke to during those weeks you were in Denver? Something flickered in Vernon's face. I would need to, because in the week I've been your neighbor, Caleb said, I have not seen a single worker on your property. Not a hand, not a stable boy, not a cook. No smoke from the kitchen chimney, no morning activity in the barn. He looked at the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to know the names of these staff members Mr. Hale claims were given time off. I'd like to know if they can be located and questioned. Garrison was on his feet. Objection, this is speculation. It's a request for evidence, Caleb said. If the staff exists, they can testify. If they can testify, we'll hear it. Judge Thornton leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. I'll allow the request. Continue, Mr. Hart. Caleb turned back to Vernon. You mentioned Edgar Thorne earlier. How do you know Mr. Thorne? The stillness that moved across Vernon's face lasted only a fraction of a second. He's a business associate. Did you ever discuss with Mr. Thorne the possibility of him marrying Elena? Certainly not. That's another of her fabrications. So if we brought Mr. Thorne here to testify, he would deny that any such conversation ever took place. Vernon's pause this time was measurable. I cannot speak to what Mr. Thorne might say, but I can tell you I never— Your Honor, Caleb said, turning to the bench, I'd like to request that the court subpoena Edgar Thorne to testify about any conversations he may have had with Mr. Hale regarding Elena. Garrison was standing before Caleb finished the sentence. This is a fishing expedition. Mr. Thorne has nothing to do with whether this marriage is— Actually, Judge Thornton said in the slow, deliberate way of someone making a decision as they speak, I think it might. If Mr. Hale was attempting to arrange a marriage for his ward without her consent, that speaks directly to why she might have chosen to marry someone else. He looked at Sheriff Coleman. Sheriff, send word to Mr. Thorne that his testimony is required at the continuation of this hearing. The crack in Vernon's composure was almost invisible. Almost. Pism. They found Margaret Winters at Mrs. Chen's boarding house the next evening, after dark. The elderly woman who answered the door studied them for a long moment before opening it wider. Second door on the left, she said. The girl is expecting someone. Be quick and be quiet. She ran a respectable house. Margaret was a small woman in her 30s with nervous eyes and a carpet bag sitting packed and ready by the door, prepared to run if necessary. Her children weren't with her, Caleb noticed. She had sent them somewhere safe before making this choice. She had been crying or was close to it. She twisted her hands together without seeming to notice. I heard about the hearing, she said before either of them spoke. I've been thinking about whether to come forward since I first saw the notice. She paused. Vernon will destroy me if I talk. He'll make sure I never work in this county again. My children, he's already preparing to destroy you, Elena said quietly. Silence won't protect you. It never protected anyone he decided to target. A long silence. Sit down, Margaret said, and both of you. I have things to tell you. Whether I can say them under oath, I don't know yet, but you deserve to hear the truth. She began with the wine she had been poured before she could pour it herself, the careful way truth sometimes needs to be eased out of a person who has held it too long under pressure. She talked about working for Vernon Hale for 2 years, beginning before he married Elena's mother, about his transformation once the marriage was secured, about the way he looked at women, not with desire exactly, but with the assessing gaze of a man calculating value, utility, return on investment. He's done it before, she said. Not the cellar, not exactly, but the control. A young maid before Elena's mother came into the picture. She lasted 4 months. She disappeared suddenly. Vernon said she'd run off with a traveling merchant. Elena had gone very still. And my mother, she said. Tell me about my mother. Margaret looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who has been carrying a specific weight and is about to put it down. Your mother tried to leave him, she said, 3 months before she died. I heard the argument through the walls. She had found something, I don't know what, some document, some correspondence, and she threatened to take it to the county courthouse. A pause. He told her what would happen to her if she did, to her reputation, to her finances, to you. Another pause longer. She backed down, and then she got sick. Elena said nothing. I always told myself it was just a fever, Margaret continued. Women die of fevers. It happens. But I remember. She stopped, started again. I remember that when your mother's temperature climbed, when she asked for a doctor, I went to Vernon for permission to send for one. It was his house, his money. You needed his authorization to spend it. Her voice had become careful and precise, the voice of someone describing something terrible, one fact at a time. He told me she was being dramatic, that she'd be fine by morning, that I should give her willow bark tea and not encourage her to be dependent. The fire crackled. She was dead by morning, Margaret said. The room held very still. Elena's face was composed in the way that comes after you have passed through the worst of something and are now on the other side of it, where there are no more tears because the body has simply used them all. He didn't kill her with his hands, Elena said finally. The flatness in her voice was not grief or not only grief, it was knowledge. The specific weight of knowing something that cannot be unknown. He just made sure no one helped her. Yes, and no one questioned it. He's Vernon Hale. Margaret said it simply without bitterness, just the bare fact of it. No one questions Vernon Hale, not in this county. Elena looked at the table for a long moment, then she looked up. Will you testify, she asked. Everything you've told us. Will you say it in that courtroom under oath in front of Vernon and his lawyers and everyone in this town who's decided it's easier not to see him clearly? Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. If I do that, my children, he will ruin you regardless, Elena said. Yeah, not cruelly, truthfully. You worked for him, you know things. He won't leave you alone simply because you stayed quiet. The only question is whether your silence costs only you or whether it costs everyone else he's going to hurt next. A very long silence. I need until morning, Margaret said. They were walking back through the dark streets, ward where Caleb had tied the horse, when a voice came from the alley beside the feed store. Mrs. Hart, Mr. Hart. Caleb's hand went to his revolver. The figure that stepped into the moonlight had his hands raised not in threat, but in the gesture of a man who has thought carefully about how to approach someone and settled on total transparency. Edgar Thorne was older than Caleb had imagined, closer to 60 than 50, heavy-set and prosperous, in expensive clothes now somewhat rumpled. He moved with a careful deliberateness of someone whose body had recently been reminded of its vulnerabilities. In the pale light, Caleb could see the yellowish shadow of bruising around one eye, imperfectly concealed by the brim of his hat. "I received a subpoena today," Thorne said without preamble, "requiring my testimony at your hearing, and then last evening 2 men found me in an alley near my hotel and explained to me what would happen if I testified honestly." He paused. "They said Mr. Hale sent his regards." Elena looked at the bruising she could now see along his jaw. "He had you beaten." He made his position clear. "Yes. And you're here anyway." Thorne was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the gap between buildings, carrying the distant music from the saloon. "I have been 3 times married," he said at last. "I have been on each occasion a poor husband. I am aware of this. And when I look at you," he glanced at Elena, "I see a young woman who was intended to become my 4th wife, and I see what the circumstances of that marriage would have been, and I find I cannot pretend to be a man of good conscience if I say nothing." "You agreed to the arrangement," Caleb said. "Not accusatory, just precise." "I did. I was interested. I am a lonely old man, and Vernon made it sound reasonable." He straightened slightly, something resolving in his bearing. "Vernon calling it a business arrangement, he didn't make it one. There was a human being in those negotiations who was never asked what she wanted. And then when I learned what he had done to keep her compliant..." He stopped. "No, I will not hide behind that anymore." "You'll testify?" Elena asked. "Everything, the arrangement, the money, the terms Vernon proposed, everything, including the fact that Vernon described you to me, Mrs. Hart, using language I wouldn't use to describe a horse." Elena held his gaze. "Healthy stock," she said quietly. "Was that the phrase?" Thorne flinched. "Yes, I know." She had known from the night in the cellar when Vernon's footsteps had stopped above her head. She had known what she was worth to him. Having it confirmed was different from the knowing smaller somehow, now that she had built something larger than it. "I'll be in that courtroom tomorrow morning," Thorne said. "Whatever happens after that's tomorrow's problem." They watched him walk away, moving carefully through the dark. That night they sat by the fire long after they should have slept. The house was quiet. The wind had settled. Outside, the frost was forming again on the grass, turning the world silver and still in the moonlight, and Cedar Ridge lay asleep around them, as if the next morning held nothing more significant than another ordinary day. After a long time, Elena said, "Why did you really come to Colorado?" Caleb looked at the fire. "I told you," he said, "a fresh start. You told me the what, not the why." She was not pushing. Her voice was gentle, genuinely curious. The question of someone who has decided to trust and wants to understand what they're trusting. "You came to disappear. People don't need to disappear from ordinary lives." He was quiet for long enough that she might have let him be. She didn't push. She waited with the patience of someone who had learned to wait. "I had a brother," Caleb said finally. "Thomas. He was 12. I was 15. He stopped. "You don't have to." "I know." He looked at his hands, then at the fire. "We were working the ranch in Kansas. A horse spooked a big one, a gray mare that had never given us any trouble. She kicked him. He went down hard and He paused for a long time. I froze. I stood there and I froze. He was bleeding unconscious and I just stopped, like a mechanism that had seized up. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stood there while he bled. The fire shifted, settled. My father found us eventually, got Thomas to a doctor. He survived, but there was damage to his brain from the injury and from lying in the field. He was never the same after. He died 2 years later. Complications. A pause. I have always known that if I had acted faster, if I had run to the house, gotten help, done something, instead of nothing, he might have lived. Elena said nothing. The room held very still. I've been running from that ranch since the day Thomas died, Caleb said. Town to town, job to job, telling myself I just needed a fresh start. New land, new name, new life. But fresh starts don't actually work when what you're trying to leave is yourself. He looked at her then finally. When I heard you crying in the dark, it was Thomas again. It was every moment I had ever stood still and let something terrible happen, while I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, wasn't my place, wasn't my business. He shook his head. I couldn't freeze again. Not again. Elena's hand moved across the small distance between them and rested on his. She didn't squeeze, didn't grip, just placed it there, steady and warm. They sat like that for a long time, neither speaking while the fire burned and the wind moved around the house, and the night grew deep and still. Finally, Elena said very quietly, "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for asking." She looked at him. In the firelight, the hollows that the cellar had carved into her face were beginning to fill, slowly, steadily, the way a field recovers after a hard frost. She was not the same girl he had pulled up from the dark. She was becoming someone else, and he was watching it happen in real time, the way you watch something rare if you are patient enough to stay still. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. She went to bed. He stayed by the fire watching the coals, thinking about the morning. Dawn came gray and cold with frost covering everything. They rode into Cedar Ridge together, their breath fogging in the October air, the mountains huge and indifferent behind them. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. People were drawn not by justice, but by the particular appetite that gathers around public drama, the human hunger to watch consequence arrive for someone. Vernon stood on the courthouse steps in an expensive suit surrounded by his lawyers. When he saw them approach, his expression arranged itself into something that resembled concern. "Elena," he said as though relieved, "thank God you're all right. I've been sick with worry. Please come speak with me privately before this hearing begins. As family." Elena looked at him with perfect steadiness. "You're not my family," she said. "You never were. Say whatever you need to say in front of witnesses." Something moved behind Vernon's eyes, not anger yet. The calculation of a man realigning pieces on a board. The hearing began. Garrison laid out their case with the practiced efficiency of an expert. The letter, the character witnesses, the portrait of an unstable girl and an opportunistic man. Vernon on the stand, sorrowful and reasonable and careful. And then Caleb said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Edgar Thorne to testify." The murmur that ran through the gallery was almost physical. Vernon's expression didn't change. Something behind it did. Silence as the seconds stretched. Then from the back of the room, "I'm here, Your Honor." Thorne walked down the center aisle with the careful dignity of a man who has made a decision that will cost him and is at peace with the price. The bruising around his eye was visible to everyone. He moved past Vernon's table without looking at it, took the witness stand, was sworn in. When Caleb asked him about the business arrangement with Vernon and Hale, Thorne told it plainly. The meetings, the negotiations, the figure $50,000 in exchange for the right to marry Elena. The language Vernon had used in describing her. The certainty communicated without ambiguity that Elena was Vernon's to dispose of as he saw fit. The courtroom did not erupt. It went very, very quiet, the particular silence of a room in which people are revising their understanding of something they thought they understood. "Mr. Hale." Vernon was on his feet, his composure beginning to fracture at the edges. "This is fabricated. This man has a grievance against me. This is nothing but—" "And what about the men who visited you last night, Mr. Thorne?" Caleb said. Thorne looked at him steadily. "Two men came to my hotel room last evening. They struck me. Before they left, one of them said, 'Mr. Hale sends his regards and suggests you reconsider your position.' I have medical documentation of my injuries. I have the name of the hotel manager who heard the commotion." He paused. "I am here nonetheless." The silence in the courtroom changed quality. It became something with weight. Vernon's lead lawyer, Garrison, was speaking quickly in his client's ear. Vernon's hands were flat on the table, and Caleb could see the effort he was expending to keep them still. Judge Thornton looked at Vernon with an expression that had shed all appearance of neutrality. "Is Mr. Thorne describing an accurate account?" he said. "This is slander," Vernon said, quietly. "This is a coordinated attack on my reputation by people who—" "Sheriff Coleman," the judge said, "after this hearing, I want a full accounting of Mr. Thorne's medical records and any witnesses to the incident he's described. Are we clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Coleman said from his position by the wall. Something had changed in his posture, a subtle settling, a realignment. The expression of a man who has been straddling a fence and has just quietly chosen a side. Garrison tried to repair the damage. His cross-examination of Thorne was sharp and systematic, attacking Thorne's credibility, questioning his motivations, suggesting he was a disgruntled business associate, seeking revenge for failed investments. Thorne endured it without becoming defensive, answering each challenge with the measured patience of a man who had nothing left to protect. When Garrison finished, Thornton called a brief recess. In the hallway, Caleb and Elena stood close together while Vernon's lawyers clustered on the far side of the room. Margaret Winters had not yet arrived. Whether she would come at all, whether she had made her choice during the long dark hours of the previous night, they didn't know. Elena looked at the door. "If she doesn't come," she began. "She'll come," Caleb said. He didn't know that. He simply chose to say it and chose to believe it because some choices you make with the available evidence and some you make in the absence of it because the alternative is paralysis. The recess ended. They filed back in. Garrison began building the next layer of Vernon's defense. The argument that even if Thorne's account were accurate, it had no bearing on Elena's mental competence or the validity of the marriage. He was calling Vernon back to the stand when the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Margaret Winters walked in. She was dressed plainly, her hair pulled back severely, her face pale but set. She walked down the center aisle with the deliberate steps of someone who has made an impossible choice and will not dishonor it by hesitating. She didn't look at Vernon, she looked at Elena. Elena looked back. Something passed between them. Women who had survived the same predator, who had made different choices in the aftermath, and were now standing in the same room on the same side of the only argument that mattered. "Your Honor," Caleb said, "I have one more witness." Margaret Winters took the stand, with her hands folded tightly in her lap, and her eyes fixed on a middle point above the gallery, the gaze of a person telling the truth to the largest possible audience, rather than to any single person in the room. She was sworn in. She stated her name, her former occupation, her relationship to the household of Vernon Hale. Garrison rose immediately. "Your Honor, this witness was on no prepared list. We've had no opportunity." "Neither was Mr. Thorne," Judge Thornton said, with the clipped precision of a man who has heard the argument and found it insufficient. "I'll allow it. Sit down, Mr. Garrison." Caleb approached the stand. "Mrs. Winters," he said, "how long did you work in Mr. Hale's household?" 2 years, starting 6 months before he married Elena's mother, Mrs. Caroline Mercer. "And during that time, did you observe Mr. Hale's treatment of his wife?" "I did." A pause. "He was controlling, systematically so. He managed every aspect of her life, her finances, her social interactions, what she was permitted to discuss with visitors. In the early months, she seemed to accommodate it. By the end of the first year, she had become very quiet." "You said by the end of the first year. What happened in the second year of the marriage?" "Mrs. Hale found something. I don't know the exact nature of the document's correspondence, I believe involving Mr. Hale's business interests in a way that she found deeply troubling. She told me she intended to take it to the courthouse, to have it examined by an authority outside of Mr. Hale's control." The gallery was completely still. "What happened after she expressed that intention?" "She and Mr. Hale argued. Badly. I heard it through the walls. He was very clear about what would happen to her if she proceeded. To her reputation, to her finances, to her relationship with Elena." Margaret's voice remained steady. "She withdrew her intention, gave him the documents. 3 weeks later, she fell ill." "Ill how?" "Fever, high and rapid in onset. She asked for a doctor. She asked me directly and asked Mr. Hale. He told me she was being dramatic, that she needed rest, not medical attention, that I should give her willow bark tea and not encourage her to exaggerate her symptoms." A pause. "I obeyed because it was his house and he was the one who paid my wages and I had 3 children to feed." The pause this time was longer. She was dead by morning. The silence in the courtroom had a texture to it now, something heavy and specific. The collective weight of a room full of people revising an understanding they had held for years. "You believe Mr. Hale's decision to withhold medical care contributed to Mrs. Hale's death?" "I believe," Margaret said very carefully, "that a woman who asked for a doctor and was refused one died of an illness that a doctor might have treated. I cannot say what was in Mr. Hale's mind. I can say what I saw." Vernon moved at his table, a single small motion, a hand pressing flat against the wood. One of his lawyers put a restraining hand on his arm. Garrison's cross-examination was fierce and precisely targeted. He attacked Margaret's credibility. He produced records of a salary dispute she'd had with Vernon upon leaving his employ, suggesting she had invented the dispute as leverage and might do the same now. He characterized her account of Caroline's death as the speculation of a disgruntled former employee entirely uncorroborated, designed to inflame the court against his client. Margaret endured it without breaking. She answered each challenge with the same deliberate care she had brought to her initial testimony, neither defensive nor aggressive, simply present and certain. "My children will suffer for my choice here today," she said when Garrison had finished his last thrust. "I am aware of that. I made the choice anyway. I made it because I looked at my daughters last night, and I thought about what kind of world I want them to grow up in, and it is not the world that existed while I stayed silent." She looked directly at Vernon for the first time. It is not the world that Vernon Hale operates in. Vernon opened his mouth. One of his lawyers gripped his arm. It was the moment Caleb had been waiting for, the crack in the dam. Not the dramatic collapse. The crack. The thing that showed the rest of the room what was underneath the composed and generous exterior they had all on some level agreed to accept. Vernon Hale leaned forward slightly and in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough said, "Your sister's ranch has a bank loan coming due, doesn't it, Margaret? I would hate for there to be complications with the renewal." It was almost a whisper, but the courtroom was absolutely silent, and it carried. Judge Thornton's gavel struck the bench like a gunshot. "Mr. Hale." The judge's voice had the particular quality of cold fury, not raised, not theatrical, but with an absolute certainty that the entire room would hear every word of it. "That is the second time in these proceedings that you have made what sounds very much like a threat against a witness. I want you to be extremely clear on this point. The next comment of that nature will result in your immediate removal from my courtroom and a charge of contempt. Do I have your understanding?" Vernon settled back in his chair. His face had gone carefully blank, the mask back in place, slightly too tight now to sit perfectly. But everyone in the room had seen what lived underneath it. Sheriff Coleman by the wall had taken out a small notebook and was writing something. He wrote for a long time. Eleanor took the stand last. She walked to the witness box with the composure of someone who has decided in advance exactly what they are going to say and has made their peace with the cost of saying it. She was sworn in. She folded her hands on the rail and looked at the room with clear, steady eyes. Caleb approached. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "in your own words, can you tell the court what happened to you in the 3 months preceding your marriage?" She told it. She told it without drama or exaggeration or the kind of performed suffering that might have played better to the gallery. She told it the way she had survived it, with precision, with exactness, with the particular authority of a person who was there and knows what happened and refuses to be talked out of it. She described the dinners with Edgar Thorne being dressed and presented, and observed like something at an auction the growing horror as she understood what Vernon intended for her. She described her refusal and Vernon's response, not a rage, she said, not exactly, but a cold and systematic decision to remove her freedom until she provided the compliance he required. She described the cellar, the chains, the darkness, the marks she had scratched on the wall. "I stopped counting at some point," she said. "I started counting again when I heard footsteps on the ground above me. There is a particular sound wood makes when someone crosses it, a specific creak that told me whether it was Vernon or not. After a while, I knew the difference between the footsteps of someone bringing water and the footsteps of someone who had forgotten I was there." The room was absolutely still. "The last time he came," she continued, "he told me he was going to Denver and would decide what to do with me when he returned. He said that in a certain tone of voice, the tone he uses when a decision has already been made, and he's simply notifying you of it." She paused. "I understood that he had decided I was more trouble than I was worth, that it was simpler to let the problem resolve itself." Another pause. "I had been without food for 4 days when Mr. Hart arrived." Garrison's cross-examination was aggressive. He questioned her mental state, her credibility, her judgment. He suggested that Caleb had found a vulnerable girl and manipulated her into a hasty marriage for purposes Garrison left artfully unspecified. He pushed on the speed of the marriage, less than a day's acquaintance, before agreeing to it as evidence of impaired reasoning. Elena waited for each question to finish, then answered it. "You're suggesting," she said at one point, "that marrying quickly indicates that I wasn't thinking clearly." "I'm suggesting it might, yes." Or she said, "It might indicate that I understood the situation I was in with extreme clarity, that I had 8 weeks in a cellar to think about exactly what kind of man Vernon Hale was and what he intended for me, and that when someone offered me a way out that was legal and immediate and left me with my own choices intact, I took it." She held his gaze. "Which of those explanations requires less intelligence?" Garrison tried 2 more angles and abandoned them both. He sat down. Judge Thornton looked at the room with the expression of a man who has made up his mind and is choosing his words with the care that permanence requires. "We'll recess until tomorrow morning," he said, "at which time I will deliver my ruling." "What's I stammer?" They rode home in the long autumn light. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said that the silence couldn't hold better. Caleb was aware of Elena behind him, the warmth of her, the weight of her, the fact of her presence after months in which her presence had been deliberately erased. That evening she cooked dinner, not because it was her role, but because she needed her hands to be doing something, and the kitchen had become hers in the way that spaces become yours when you work in them consistently. Caleb tended the horses. When he came in, the table was set and the room smelled of wood smoke and whatever she'd managed to make from the provisions they had left. They ate without talking much. Outside, the wind picked up, moving around the house with the easy authority of something that owned this valley long before either of them arrived. After a while, Elena said, "If he rules against us." "I know," Caleb said. She looked at him. We take the horses and whatever we can carry, and we don't stop until we're somewhere his influence doesn't reach. We start over. You'd give up the ranch. The ranch is land. Land can be bought again." He looked at her directly. "You can't be replaced." Elena was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate. "I've been thinking," she said, "about my mother, about what Margaret told us, about the fact that he let her die and no one questioned it because he's Vernon Hale, and it was easier to believe the story he told." She paused. "I've been thinking about all the women who will come after me, the ones he'll find next, because men like Vernon always find someone next." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about what you do with surviving something," she said. "Not just enduring it, but afterward, what you build with it." She looked at the fire. "I want to teach," she said. If we win tomorrow, I want to open a school, not just for children, for women, for the girls who don't know their legal rights, who don't know how to recognize what's happening to them until it's too late to leave, who don't know that they have options." A pause. "I want to build the thing that would have helped my mother." Caleb looked at her for a long time. "Then we'll build it," he said. "Me." Morning. The courtroom was fuller than it had been on either previous day. Cedar Ridge had been talking all night in the saloon and kitchens, in the spaces between buildings where people gathered to process the things they've seen. The town was making up its mind the way towns do when a story has reached the point where a choice must be made about what to believe. Vernon sat with his lawyers, composed and still. He had not looked at Elena since the previous day. He looked at no one now, only at the judge's empty bench with the expression of a man running internal calculations. Judge Thornton entered at precisely 9 o'clock. The room fell to complete silence. He carried papers. He set them on the bench, arranged them with deliberate care, and looked at the room. "This has been one of the more disturbing cases I've presided over in 20 years on the bench," he began. His voice was even and carried without effort. "I've heard testimony alleging imprisonment. I've heard evidence of an arrangement to sell a minor in marriage as a component of a business deal. I've heard credible accounts of a witness being physically assaulted to prevent his testimony. And I've watched a man I previously considered respectable make threats against a witness in open court." The room held very still. "Mr. Hale has presented evidence of his ward's supposed mental fragility. A letter from a physician. She has never met character witnesses whose descriptions could equally suggest grief or fear, and the assertion that no rational person would marry a stranger after less than a day's acquaintance." Vernon's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. This was the part he had expected to win. "However," the word fell like a stone, "Mr. Hale has failed to explain several troubling facts. He has failed to explain why the cellar on his property was secured with heavy chains and new locks, if not to imprison someone. He has failed to explain the credible, detailed, and corroborated testimony of Edgar Thorne regarding the arrangement to sell his ward in marriage. He has failed to explain why a genuinely concerned guardian would leave an allegedly mentally fragile 17-year-old alone for weeks without supervision or contact." Thornton paused. He looked at Vernon directly for the first time, and he has failed dramatically to conduct himself with the dignity and restraint one would expect from a man whose only concern is the welfare of the young woman in his care. Instead, I observed a man who threatened a witness in my courtroom, who attempted to use financial leverage against another witness in my courtroom, who displayed in public the precise quality of controlling fury that his stepdaughter and former housekeeper have described as his consistent private behavior. The silence was complete. "I have also observed Elena Hart." Thornton turned slightly toward her. A young woman who spoke clearly, specifically, and with full consistency about her experiences, who showed no signs of the mental incompetence or hysteria alleged by Mr. Hale, who articulated rational, I would say remarkably clear-headed reasons for every choice she made. He paused. The fact that she chose to marry quickly does not indicate impaired reasoning. It indicates that she had spent 8 weeks in a locked cellar thinking about exactly who Vernon Hale was, and that when a means of escape presented itself, she took it. That is not the action of a disturbed mind. That is the action of a person who understood her situation with considerable precision. He straightened his papers. I find that Elena Hart was mentally competent at the time of her marriage, that she entered into it of her own free will without coercion or undue influence, that the marriage is valid under Colorado territorial law. He looked at Garrison. The petition for annulment is denied. The gallery erupted. Vernon was on his feet. His lawyers were on their feet. Garrison was speaking rapidly, invoking appellate court's territorial authorities' procedural violations. Vernon himself, beneath the legal objections, was simply present in the room, at a frequency that had shifted something naked and furious in the set of his face, the thing behind the mask finally too large for it to contain. Judge Thornton's gavel struck twice. The noise subsided incompletely. Furthermore, Thornton said, and the words silenced the room as effectively as a weapon being drawn, I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for investigation into possible criminal charges, including false imprisonment, assault by hired agents, and witness intimidation. Sheriff Coleman, you will conduct a thorough investigation of the cellar on Mr. Hale's property and document any evidence of habitation or confinement. He looked at Coleman directly. You will give that investigation the same attention you would give any other potential felony. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor, Coleman said. He was already moving. The gavel fell for the last time. They documented the cellar that afternoon. Elena insisted on coming. Caleb had asked gently whether she needed to, whether this was a visit she could spare herself. She had looked at him with patient practicality. He'll say I invented it, she said. He'll say there was never anyone there. I need to be present when the evidence is recorded. I need to be the one who points to every mark and says this is mine. So they went. The estate looked different, in daylight, diminished, somehow stripped of the nighttime authority that money and landscaping create in the dark. In the October afternoon sun, it was simply a large house with well-maintained grounds, and the cellar at its back corner was simply a wooden door set into the earth. Coleman and his deputies worked methodically. They measured. They photographed in the careful way the law photographs things it intends to make permanent. They cataloged the chain heavy-gauge 4 lengths purchased new and the shattered remnants of the padlock. Inside, in the daylight, the scratches on the wall were clearly visible. Elena stood in front of them for a long moment. 58 marks. She had lost count twice and had to start over in 2 places. The wall showed that the doubled rows the uncertainty of the count. 58 days, give or take, recorded with a human fingernail against stone, because she had needed to know that time was passing, that the days were not simply dissolving into each other, that there was a count and the count would eventually end. These are yours, Coleman asked quietly. Yes, she said. He wrote it down. They left the estate with documentation that no amount of expensive lawyering could easily explain away the chain, the lock, the dimensions of the space, the scratches on the wall, the bucket in the corner that had served as the only sanitation in 8 weeks of imprisonment. Coleman looked at the total of it with the expression of a man who has been straddling a fence for too long and is feeling the strain. Mr. Hale has friends in Denver, he said as they were leaving. The prosecution won't be easy. I know, Caleb said. He'll hire the best lawyers available. He'll delay. He'll argue everything was misinterpreted. Coleman paused. But for what it's worth, what I saw in that cellar is not a wine storage room. No reasonable man could argue that it was used for wine storage. He looked at Elena. I should have looked more carefully when this started. I'm sorry for that. Elena studied him for a moment. It's not too late to be useful, she said. Not forgiving exactly, but not condemning either. The practical acknowledgement that the present required more than relitigating the past. Coleman nodded and turned back to his work. Ma! In the weeks that followed, Cedar Ridge made its adjustments. Adjustments were how small towns process things too large to simply absorb. Mrs. Patterson at the general store found that credit had become available after all. The banker, Cornelius Webb, when Caleb applied again, discovered that there were no significant concerns about character. The merchants of Cedar Ridge, watching the momentum of the community shift, quietly followed it. Vernon Hale put his estate on the market 3 weeks after the hearing. He sold it below market value, which was the move of a man who wanted to be gone more than he wanted to be fairly compensated for what he was leaving. The sale closed quickly, a mining company from Denver that saw opportunity in the land and had no interest in the reputation attached to it. Word filtered back to Cedar Ridge in the months that followed, passed through traveling merchants and letters, and the general telegraphic quality of human gossip. Vernon Hale had moved to San Francisco, then to Chicago. He moved with the particular frequency of a man whose identity depended on being somewhere that didn't yet know him, and so the radius of safe ground kept shrinking. The territorial prosecutor pursued the criminal case. It moved slowly the way criminal cases do when the accused has resources and an absence of any interest in resolution. Vernon's lawyers filed delay after delay. The Cellar evidence was argued, re-argued, contested on procedural grounds. Margaret's testimony was attacked from every available angle. In the end, the formal charges were dropped, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because Vernon Hale died in Chicago in February of the following year. Pneumonia complicated by what the doctor's letter described with clinical delicacy as a general decline. He died in a hotel room in a city that didn't know him, and no family came to claim the body. Elena received the news on a Tuesday morning in early spring. She read the letter twice, set it on the kitchen table, and looked out the window at the mountains for a long time. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked. "I thought I would feel something larger," she said. "Relief or satisfaction or, I don't know, closure." A pause. "Mostly I just feel tired, like I've been holding my breath for a year and a half, and I've finally exhaled, but I'm too tired to notice the difference." "That's all right," Caleb said. "You don't have to feel a specific thing." "I know." She looked at the letter again. "He was going to let me die in that cellar, and then he was going to tell everyone I'd run away." She folded the letter carefully. "He died in a hotel room alone. I think that's justice enough. I don't need to celebrate it." She put the letter in the small box where she kept the documents of her life, and that was the last time she spoke of Vernon Hale in any significant way. The school opened in April. It started in the church hall, Reverend Matthews offering the space on weekdays, Elena arriving at 7 in the morning and leaving at 5 in the afternoon, 3 students in the first week, 7 by the end of the first month. She taught literature and mathematics and legal literacy, the specific practical knowledge of what the law actually said about women's rights, as opposed to what they were generally told it said. She taught the difference between these, which was substantial. Within 6 months, she had 15 students. Within a year, women began arriving from ranches outside the county, women who had heard about Elena Hart's school through the particular grapevine of frontier gossip, who had daughters they wanted educated, or who were themselves searching for the knowledge they had never been offered. The church hall became too small. Margaret Winters arrived in June with her 3 children and a proposal. "I can teach practical skills," she said, sitting across the kitchen table from Elena and Caleb. "Household management, accounting, contract review. Things women need to know to run a household as a financial enterprise rather than just a domestic one." She paused. "I want to be useful. Not because I owe you. I don't think I owe you specifically, though I do owe something to the general enterprise of making this situation we're in slightly less terrible. I want to be useful because I have daughters, and I would like them to grow up in a world where what happened to you and what happened to your mother is not just accepted as the natural order." Elena hired her immediately. Margaret taught practical skills. Elena taught everything else. The students taught each other. This was the quality Elena had not anticipated, the way knowledge passed laterally through a group of women given a space in which to share it, each one arriving with something the others didn't have and leaving with something they hadn't known they needed. Edgar Thorne visited in the summer. He traveled from Denver specifically to see how things had developed, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body still recalled the alley beating, but who had decided to be grateful for it rather than bitter. "I'd like to offer a scholarship," he said, sitting on the porch, while Caleb brought coffee and Elena talked business. "For students who can't afford the tuition, consider it an investment, or penance if you prefer. I'm comfortable with either framing." Elena considered him. "What do you want in return?" "To be able to say in what remains of my life that I did one thing correctly." He looked at his hands. "I was prepared to purchase a human being. I talked myself into believing that the veneer of social custom made it acceptable. It didn't. It wasn't. I would like to spend whatever time I have left doing something that is actually acceptable. The scholarship fund was established. It bore no name Elena's decision. We'll name it after my mother, she said, when we have a proper building. Until then, it's just a fund, and what matters is what it does. The building came the following year. The autumn that Elena turned 18 was the gentlest October Cedar Ridge had seen in years. Warm days and cold nights. The kind of weather that makes you understand why people built things in these valleys. Why they kept returning despite the winters and the isolation and the particular difficulty of extracting a life from land that had its own opinions about what it would offer. She turned 18 on a Thursday. That evening, Caleb set two pieces of paper on the kitchen table. Elena looked at them. One was an annulment form filled out and signed on his side, his end of the bargain fulfilled. The other was blank. The choice was always yours, he said. It still is. Whatever you want is the right answer. Elena looked at the two pieces of paper for a long time. Then she picked up the annulment form, walked to the stove, and dropped it in. The paper caught immediately, curled and blackened, and was gone in seconds. That's not how I want to leave things, she said, turning back to face him. Not with paperwork, not with legal procedures. She looked at him with the directness that had characterized her from the first moment he'd found her, the unflinching quality of a person who has been in the dark long enough that she has no interest in obscuring things unnecessarily. What I want is to keep building what we've built, with you. Not because I have to, because it's mine and I'm choosing it. That's what you want. That's what I want. A pause. Is it what you want? He thought about Thomas. He thought about the moment in a Kansas field when he had stood still while something terrible happened and had carried the weight of it for 9 years after. He thought about the freight train to Cedar Ridge and the sound that had pulled him out of bed and everything that had followed. Yes, he said, it's what I want. She sat down across from him. Outside, the mountains were turning gold in the last of the evening light, massive and indifferent and beautiful the way they were every evening, the way they would be long after both of them were gone. Then it's decided, she said, not by law, by choice. They shook hands. Then they both laughed because it was a slightly absurd thing to do to shake hands with your spouse, and the absurdity of it was part of what made it right, made it theirs. Part of the specific and unconventional shape of a partnership that had never resembled any other. 20 years passed, not all at once and not easily, and not without the ordinary accumulation of difficulty and loss that any life lived in full carries with it. There were hard winters. There were students who left the school before they were ready, pulled back by the circumstances of their lives. There were legal battles that were won and legal battles that were simply survived. There was a year when the creek ran dry and the drought nearly broke the ranch, and they saved it by taking in 3 additional boarding students whose families paid in cattle rather than cash. But there were also 20 autumns when the mountains turned gold, 20 springs when the creek came back. 20 years of students who arrived uncertain and left changed not dramatically, not all of them, but enough. Enough to carry something forward, enough to pass it on. The schoolhouse was built in the 3rd year, proper lumber, proper windows, dormitories for boarding students, and a library that it grew room by room as donations came in from across the territory. The library bore Caroline's name printed in careful letters above the door, Caroline's room. Not a memorial, a continuation. The thing her mother had wanted and hadn't been allowed to reach made available to anyone who walked through the door. Margaret Winters taught at the school for 15 years, until her eldest daughter graduated from the Territorial College as one of its first female students in mathematics and returned to Cedar Ridge to take over the advanced curriculum. Margaret retired to her sister's ranch and sent a letter to Elena that consisted of 3 sentences. I am proud of what we built. I am sorry it took me so long to arrive at it. Please teach them to be faster. Reverend Matthews grew old in Cedar Ridge and died in the pulpit one Sunday morning at the age of 78 mid-sermon, which he would have preferred to any other exit. His wife continued the church's partnership with the school for another decade. Edgar Thorne sent a donation every year on Elena's birthday. The amount grew as his investments prospered and his conscience deepened. He died in Denver at the age of 79, having outlived 2 of his 3 previous wives and reconciled in his final years with the children he had largely neglected during his working life. He left a substantial portion of his estate to the school, not enough to make it extravagant, but enough to make it permanent. Sheriff Coleman retired after 7 years and was replaced by a younger man who had grown up watching the school's students and had formed the habit through that proximity of taking seriously the complaints of women who came to him for help. It was not a dramatic improvement. It was progress, the incremental, unsexy kind that takes decades and doesn't make for good stories, but is the only kind that lasts. On the 20th anniversary of the night Caleb Hart heard crying in the dark, the territorial governor attended a ceremony at the school. There was a reception and speeches, and the governor announced a grant to expand the school's model to 3 additional communities across the territory. Elena gave a short speech. She had learned to give short speeches, having understood early that brevity was its own form of respect about education as the process of teaching people what they are entitled to, what they have always been entitled to and have simply not been told. She did not mention Vernon Hale. That evening, she and Caleb walked back to the ranch while the mountains turned purple in the dusk. They were both older now, wearing the years in the particular way that people who have worked hard and survived things wear them, not diminished by it, but marked, changed. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Elena asked as they walked. "Sometimes," Caleb said, "usually when I can't sleep." "What do you think about when you do?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the valley grasses, the sound it made both familiar and perpetually new. "I think about the marks on the warrant," he said, "all those scratches you made, 58 of them. You were counting the days, and I think about what it meant that you kept counting, that you didn't stop counting, didn't decide the days weren't worth tracking. You kept the count even when there was no reason to keep it, except that the days were real and they were yours, and you refused to let them be swallowed." Elena was quiet. "And I think about Thomas," he said, "about what it cost me to freeze when he needed help, about the 9 years I spent running from that moment, and about the night in October when I heard you and understood that I was being given a second chance, not at him, not at fixing the thing that can't be fixed, but at being someone who acts instead of stands still." "Did it help?" she asked. "Acting. I don't know if it helped," he said. "I know it was the right thing, and I know it led to everything I have now, which is more than I deserved from the man I was when I arrived here." He looked at her. "So I suppose that's yes, in the only way that matters." She smiled. They reached the ranch in the last of the light. The house had been expanded over the years. Still modest, still practical, but with more rooms and better windows, in a garden that Elena maintained with patient attention. The school building was visible across the field, lit from within the sound of students at evening study, carrying faintly on the October air. Inside, the fire was already going. One of the students boarded with them that semester, a girl from a ranch far to the north whose parents had sent her south specifically for Elena's school, and she had gotten the habit of lighting the evening fire before dinner. Caleb and Elena sat down. It was the same small table where they had planned their strategies in those first terrifying weeks. The same fireplace where they had sat in silence the night before the hearing, and he had told her about Thomas, and she had placed her hand on his. The same room where everything had started to become itself. "Are you tired?" Elena asked. "Not especially," he said. "You?" "Not yet." She poured tea for both of them and looked at the fire. "I was thinking about the library, about whether we have enough room for the natural sciences section. Margaret's daughter keeps requesting more shelf space." "We can add a room," Caleb said. "We always say that. And we always do." She looked at him with the slight, familiar smile that had been 20 years in the making, built from 8 weeks of survival in an October night, in a broken lock, in a church in a small frontier town, and 5,000 ordinary days that had accumulated quietly and without fanfare into a life. "Then let's do it again," she said. Outside, the Colorado wind moved through the valley with the easy authority of something that belonged there completely. The mountains were dark against the stars now, enormous and patient, and indifferent to the small lights that burned in their shadow. The schoolhouse, the ranch house, the town of Cedar Ridge, a mile down the road, and all of them temporary against the permanence of those peaks, and all of them real. It had started with a scream in the dark, desperate, muffled, a human being refusing to stop existing in a hole in the ground. It had become something neither of them could have imagined from that first terrible moment. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale, but a partnership between two people who had each been carrying something heavy for too long and had set it down finally in each other's company. That was the whole of it. That was everything.